deceleration. You should assume that the jet will not decelerate during a descent on the calculated descent path unless a decel segment is provided, which is the length of the track between the small green circles on figure 13. You can assume that the jet will decelerate at 1 knot per second in level flight. In the arrival segment, you'll most likely fly at 240 or 250 knots, traveling roughly 4 miles per minute. Considering that some wind exists and that the speed factor changes during the deceleration, for all intents and purposes, you can assume that the jet will decelerate at 10 knots per nautical mile in level flight. Implications to this is then that if you did a dive for the calculated descent path at, for instance, 280 knots, you'll need 8 miles to decelerate in level flight to reach approach speed of 200 knots. Figure 14 shows the speed trend vector that shows the speed you'll have in 10 knots at the end of the arrow. As shown here, 10 knots in 10 seconds equals 1 knot per second, and it's easily identifiable. In the Flight Crew Training Manual descent chapter, you can read that the FMC will try to decelerate by reducing the rate of descent to approximately 500 feet per minute. If you need to decelerate during descent without leveling off, you can use this information for descent planning when you need to bleed off some speed. Let's say that you're descending at 280 knots indicated and you wish to decelerate to 240 knots indicated before passing level 100. When should you start the reduction and how much distance do you need to bleed off the speed? Assuming deceleration occurs at 1 knot per second, at a rate of descent of 500 feet per minute, you need 40 seconds to bleed off speed. You also need time to reduce the rate of descent from the 2,200 feet per minute at 280 knots indicated, which will require perhaps 10 additional seconds, so 50 seconds in total. Initial 10 seconds at 2,200 feet per minute going to 500 feet per minute, averaging 1,350 feet per minute, equals in 10 seconds 225 feet. The following 40 seconds at 500 feet per minute equals 333 feet. Total altitude loss during the 50 second is then 558 feet. To operationalize this method, you could say 1,000 feet before per 30 knots deceleration, or just assume 150 feet per 10 knots. Let's try it. Initial speed 320, which is pretty close to max. Final speed 240. 10 seconds reduction time, 80 seconds bleed time. Total altitude loss during the 90 second will be 1,150 feet. So initiation altitude is 1,100 and 150 feet. Approximated initiation altitude would be 1,200 feet and initiation altitude of 1,120 and an initiation altitude of 11,200 feet. As you can see, it makes little difference if you're really correct on the initiation altitude as long as you're conservative. When using this method, you should be aware that 1 knot per second is not guaranteed at 500 feet per minute. If your aircraft is heavy, particularly on the Dash 800, you should monitor the speed trend vector and decrease the rate of descent to obtain 1 knot per second rather than aiming for the descent rate. Worst case will be that your descent rate is 0, but you are decelerating and you're not busting any altitudes. The space you need to decelerate then comes down to the distance you traveled while decelerating. If you were consistent in the deceleration, you can assume that you have traveled the final speed plus half the speed interval during the time the maneuver lasted. In the 320 to 240 knots example, you would have traveled at an average speed of 280 knots for a period of 90 seconds, disregarding wind and air density. This would approximate to around speed factor 5 for 1.5 minutes, which equals 7 nautical miles. Though you may have complied with the speed restriction, if the FMC did not include this deceleration in the calculated descent path, or you have not followed the FMC, you would need an additional several miles of track distance.